We'll call this hearing to order. So, across the planet, lack of access to capital often constrains economic growth, and especially this is true in the world's least developed countries. In these emerging markets, foreign investment is critical to empowering entrepreneurs, to creating jobs, and of course to reducing poverty. America has an undeniable interest in supporting the development of vibrant and stable economies around the world, and healthy private sectors promote good governance, support thriving civil societies, they help reduce civil strife within the country, and the resulting stability is not only good for our national security, it also benefits U.S. exports, it benefits jobs. Increasingly, other countries are working to advance their economic and political interests by shaping overseas markets. Beijing is doing this in a big way. China's $1 trillion One Belt, One Road initiative, could be contrasted with the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt war-torn Europe. But it works in a very different way. If you visit any African capital, you'll see China's name on new construction projects. But as Chairman Yoho and Smith's subcommittee know well, China often entices foreign governments in search of easy money and then saddles them with unsustainable debt burdens. And they do that through basically predatory lending practices. In the Indian Ocean, for example, Sri Lanka was forced to forfeit a 99-year lease to one of its strategic ports because it could not afford the debt burden on that Chinese loan. The U.S. cannot and shouldn't match China's investments dollar for dollar, but we can and should do more to support international economic development and do it with partners who've embraced the private sector development model and done so under a concept of rule of law. Today, we will hear from the President and CEO of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, whose mission is to complement traditional U.S. foreign assistance by mobilizing private capital in support of America's development objectives, in support of our foreign policy interests. This was established in the 1970s. OPIC was to provide, to quote from the document, business-like management of investment incentives. And that included political risk insurance, direct loans, loan guarantees, and other services to developing nations. So we're 50 years later here. The OPIC's toolkit has largely remained the same, while the international economic landscape has changed dramatically. And that's why I am in support of this bipartisan legislation by our subcommittee chairman, Yoho, to build a modern development finance institution that will promote enduring growth in emerging economies and will support our U.S. national security objectives. In an era of tight budgets, this proposal would consolidate the resources and consolidate the expertise of OPEC and the Agency for International Development's Development Credit Authority. And it would do all this under one roof with new powers to make limited equity investments, conduct feasibility studies, provide wraparound services such as grants and technical assistance, and double its book of business. This proposal would also create an independent inspector general. Now that would increase the accountability for taxpayers. And it would put in place tough statutory benchmarks that must be met to ensure that American development finance complements and does not crowd out private sector investment. I'm encouraged that the administration has embraced this bipartisan approach, which members of this committee have been working on, and today we'll hear more about its vision for international cooperation and how the new development finance institution would work with USAID and Millennium Challenge Corporation to ensure coordination between our development agencies. With the right leadership and authorities, a new development finance institution can be a powerful instrument to create opportunities in countries hungry for growth and jobs, and its creation would also send a strong signal about America's commitment to international economic engagement in uncertain times. And with that, let me yield to the ranking member, Mr. Berra, today for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while Facebook may be a household name, I think this is the most important hearing that's happening this morning because the impact of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation that you oversee, Mr. Washburn, has had the ability and has impacted lives of millions of folks across this world. This is a very timely hearing. As we look at the BUILD Act, as we think about how we modernize overseas investment and credit, it is one of the remarkable things that we can do in terms of goodwill from the United States and not cost the taxpayers anything, actually generate revenue for the Treasury as well as generate goodwill around the world. So as we look at these programs, it's important for us to examine OPIC's story as well as its role in the development toolkit. Founded in 1971, OPIC seeks to promote economic growth in developing and emerging markets by providing political risk insurance and direct loans and guarantees to businesses. And while OPIC is appropriated by Congress, it actually returns, as I said, over $250 million to the taxpayers because it runs a surplus, and it's achieving important development outcomes. OPIC is doing this while enhancing the welfare of its recipients. One small example is its partnership with Microbuild, which is a Housing First microfinance program established by Habitat for Humanity. Microbuild provides microfinance lending to families who do not have access to traditional means of credit in developing countries like Cambodia. By investing in the Microbuild Fund, OPIC has allowed thousands of low-income individuals around the world to find homes. It's a great example of development at work. OPIC helped to crowd in investment for Microbuild and improve the lives of new homeowners who would not have been able to access the financing otherwise. This focus on quality and improved outcomes is in stark contrast to other countries who are in development finance. Take, for example, the Isimba and Karumba dams in Uganda, funded by the Exim Bank of China, both of which have sprouted cracks. It's probably not a good thing that you want to see in a dam. Development finance by the newly empowered DFI then offers a high-quality alternative to Chinese financing. As we seek to confront the challenges of the 21st century and to ensure that the youth dividend is not wasted in developing countries, development finance can be a powerful tool in our toolkit. It'll need to be wielded expertly by our development professionals and cannot replace our other forms of assistance, but rather complement them. Ultimately, development finance can improve the lives and well-being of millions of people, catalyze private sector growth, build capacity in recipient nations, and set these nations on a path to self-reliance. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Washburn on how a newly empowered DFI can achieve these development outcomes in a sustainable and responsible way. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Berra, and this morning I am pleased to welcome Ray Washburn, President, CEO of OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. This is his first appearance before our committee, and he brings to the table decades of experience in business and investment, including overseas, and including in the real estate and restaurant industries over the course of his career. He has served on the board and loan committees of several banks, infrastructure, construction, and manufacturing businesses. He's been engaged in those as well. He's spent a great deal of time in Africa, where he funded the construction of a new K-12 school for children in Zambia. So we very much appreciate him being with us today To discuss this and without objection, the witness's full prepared statement is going to be made part of the record. Members here are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions to him or extraneous material for the record. We'll ask him to summarize his remarks, and then we'll go to questions. I know the Summit of Americas starts today, and I know something about the flight schedule down to Lima, Peru. So I think we're going to have to probably wrap up by 12:15 for you to make that flight. So we'll go right to your opening statement now. And thank you again, Mr. Washburn.
Thank you for inviting me to testify today on this critical topic. Chairman Royce, I'd like to acknowledge the work you have done to advance U.S. foreign policy, particularly in Africa. From the African Growth and Opportunity Act to empowering women to electrify Africa, you are a step ahead. Dr. Barra, I enjoyed getting to know you yesterday and learning more about your priorities. Indeed, this committee's bipartisan work has helped set the stage for the administration's proposal for the United States to establish a reformed, more effective development financial institution with modernized tools and a focus on supporting private sector-driven development. When it comes to meeting the massive development needs around the globe and advancing American foreign policy, this proposal and the legislation the committee is weighing is essential. As you know, development finance tools such as loans, guarantees, and political risk insurance to facilitate private sector investment in emerging markets that will have positive developmental impact. These are transactions the private sector won't do on their own. Through OPIC, U.S. government has used these tools to back projects in key sectors such as power, water, and health that improve life for millions and lay the groundwork for economic growth. Likewise, the U.S. government has used USAID's Development Credit Authority to drive private investment in the countries that have not had sufficient or any access to commercial finance. This model of mobilizing private investment is only becoming more prominent as the needs in the developing world are just too great to meet with government resources alone. Yet U.S. capabilities have become outdated as we have gone without significant legislative updates. As a result, we lack the modern 21st century mechanisms needed to either compete with countries like China or cooperate with our allies like Britain, Germany, and Japan, which are investing heavily in emerging markets. And a global competition for influence is on. While I was in Asia, I saw how China's Belt and Road Initiative is changing the political and economic landscape. The amount of investment China has planned for this initiative is staggering. Aimed at interconnecting 65% of the world's population, 1/3 of the world's GDP, and 1/4 of all goods and services. Of course, the condition of many of these loans is that Chinese firms and labor get the business. And we know what happens when countries can't pay. In December, for example, Sri Lanka gave control of a strategic port to Beijing for 99 years. This comes as China has been stepping up its presence in the Indian Ocean and South China Sea and all of its critical shipping lanes. Mr. Chairman, we have to be engaged in the developing world with a robust alternative to these state-directed investments, which can leave developing countries worse off. And we have an alternative in a new United States Development Finance Institution. This proposal is a result of the President's executive order on reorganizing government, which prompted a fresh interagency look over several months. We found that the U.S. government's ability to deploy these tools strategically is limited by the outdated legal authorities and fragmentation. With this in mind, the administration developed a proposal to improve efficiencies, reform programming, and as envisioned by the National Security Strategy, elevate these tools to advance U.S. foreign policy goals. The President's budget proposes to consolidate multiple U.S. development finance institutions into a new stand-alone development finance institution. The DFI will have better policy alignment and strong links to state and USAID to ensure its transactions align with U.S. foreign policy and leverage USAID's programming. This includes $56 million in funding for technical assistance and grants for potential DFI projects that need a bridge to becoming investment ready. We also need governance and management structures to ensure the DFI and USAID's field work seamlessly. The administration is requesting $96 million in administrative expenses for the DFI. However, through careful loan and insurance underwriting, it is expected the DFI will not only offset its own operating cost, but also return hundreds of millions of dollars to the U.S. Treasury. The new DFI will include reforms to better manage taxpayer risk, ensure its investments are additional to the private sector. We will not subsidize projects that can or should be financed on their own, and we will ensure that our work upholds the highest environmental, social, and worker rights standards. Another part of the reform DFI is increased transparency and accountability through expanded inspection and oversight. The President's budget requests $2 million for this purpose. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, in 7 months as the head of OPIC, I've seen the power of the private sector unleashed to advance U.S. foreign policy. OPIC approved a transaction which will increase Ukraine's energy independence from Russia. OPIC formally launched its 2X Women's Initiative to catalyze over $1 billion in capital to invest in projects that empower women. And OPIC signed an MOU with our Japanese counterparts to bolster investment in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. A new modernized DFI would be far more competitive, creating countless opportunities throughout the developing world. But this modernization of development finance cannot happen without the support of this committee. I'm extremely thankful for the leadership of Mr. Yoho for embracing this concept through H.R. 5105. Indeed, just last evening, the administration released a statement noting its strong support for the goals of this legislation. I look forward to working with the committee as the process moves forward to ensure the DFI is structured for long-term success. I'll be happy to address any questions you may have.
Very good. I have some quick questions for you. And as you know, one of the advantages of USAID's Development Credit Authority is it relies on the expertise of the men and the women in the field, and that their expertise helps to ensure that the risk-sharing agreements are in line with America's development objectives. So the question I have is, you're going to merge the Development Credit Authority and OPEC. Would the new development finance institution still be able to benefit from USAID's personnel in the field? Is that what this is predicated on?
Yes, sir. I met with Administrator Mark Green last week. We have his strong support. We have a letter of support from AID. What happens in the field, they can use OPIC now as a force multiplier, because USAID right now has one tool, and with now merged in with the new DFI, they'll have 7 different financing tools.
So just so we have a grasp on this, what sort of institutional linkages here do you envision between USAID and the Development Credit Authority then?
Well, the Development Credit
and other government agencies.
The Development Credit Authority will be moved over to OPIC and administered by OPIC, but the field staff will still be USAID.
All right, all right. Chairman Yoho's Build Act would authorize the new development finance institution to make limited equity investments in projects. So I just ask, what investment criteria would the new development or the new DFI use to ensure that such authority goes to worthy recipients, and that it is not politicized, and that it does not replace private sector capital?
Well, what the Equity Authority gives us is it helps modernize OPIC's financing tools. Currently, every other DFI in the world has Equity Authority, and we have an opportunity to participate in some very strategic investments with the British and the Germans and others, and we don't have the ability to do that because we are purely a debt instrument at this time. So having the Equity Authority enables us to participate in many more projects.
We discussed one example. There are a number of examples of predatory practices in terms of loans that we've seen applied by other countries. During Secretary Tillerson's trip to Africa, I know he warned nations on the continent not to forfeit any elements of your sovereignty as you enter into loans with China. As you noticed in your testimony, you mentioned a condition of many of these loans is that Chinese firms and Chinese labor get the businesses, not local firms, right? Not people in country. And that comes at a cost. A new think tank paper out last month identifies 8 countries that China is loaning to at risk of debt distress. So how would a new development finance institution counter this predatory Chinese model and allow for sustainable economic growth?
Well, in the banking business, we call what the Chinese are doing called loan to own. Their whole purpose is to overloan on projects with the purpose to go in and take control of them. As you know, the United States, this development authority will only make private sector-led projects. We don't lend to state enterprises. And a considerable amount of equity goes into these projects. So we've had a great success in investing with the private sector into these areas. One thing that the equity authority gives us is the ability to counteract a lot of these Chinese investments because we don't have enough tools in our tool belt to compete with them.
Yeah. My time's going to expire here, so I'll go to Dr. Ami Bera. And he's deferring to Mr. Brad Sherman.
I think the basic facts are clear. You do a lot to help international development, which is an important objective of the United States. And instead of at a cost to the taxpayer, you actually return some money to the taxpayer. What's absurd is you're not functioning under a long-term authorization. That is not your fault. That is Congress's fault. Back in 2007, we worked together on a comprehensive long-term reauthorization. My hope is that the provisions of that bill find their way into the legislation we're working on. But I want to commend OPIC for doing what I'd like to see other agencies do, and that is take congressional input seriously. You have adopted by regulation or by policy many of the provisions of that 2007 bill, which passed this committee overwhelmingly with the support of the chairman, and which, as a matter of fact, I think we were both chair and ranking member of the relevant subcommittee that created that product. And I would hope that your staff would indicate whether you have an objection to including those same provisions in the new legislation. In particular, a preference for renewable energy projects, annual reports to Congress, support for international workers' rights. I assume that these are things that are now part of your ongoing process and that you wouldn't have an objection to seeing them in statutory language. Mr. Washburn?
Yes, sir. Well, thank you, Representative Sherman, and thank you for our conversation yesterday. We talked many of these points out, and thank you for your leadership. And you went over yesterday in 2007 your frustrations in getting this bill pushed forward.
I have been a strong supporter of a unicameral legislature for the federal government for a long time.
Yes.
To Nebraska, yes.
Okay. And your points, we went back and discussed them with the staff, and the provisions of the bill you championed, many of them have become part of OPIC policy, and we're happy to have our staff get together with yours to go over the other specific issues that you don't feel like are included.
And I want to commend you for having a policy against what I call an anti-Armenia railroad and for limitations on investments in Gaza. The new bill does not have the provision that would require you to have on your board a representative of small business and a representative of organized labor. Have the people filling those posts been useful? Would it be useful to have those people on your board in the future?
Yes, sir. I had nothing to do with the makeup of the board. That was what the committee brought to us. They have been helpful in the past, yes.
Okay. Yes. My colleagues will point out, usually I have a host of not entirely pleasant questions for witnesses, and I'm at a loss with I could indeed. but that would be so uncharacteristic that the effect on the cardiovascular system of some in the room would not be something I could take responsibility for. I go through a few of, now when it comes to the extractive industry transparency standards, it's one thing to say that OPEC project would adhere to those standards, but could you live with a rule that said that the host country in all of its activities would live with those extractive industry standards?
Sir, whatever the committee decides to include in the bill is how OPEC will operate, so I don't have a comment on that.
At the risk to Karen's health, I will yield back.
We thank the gentleman for yielding. We go now to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Mr. Chairman, I will yield to Mr. Yoho.
I thank my colleague from California, Mr. Washburn. Thank you for being here. We're excited, obviously, with the rollout of this bill. I want to thank Chairman Royce and Member Engel and all the people that are on the committee that have co-sponsored this bill, H.R. 5105, the BUILD Act. The BUILD Act sets out to accomplish one not-so-simple thing, transitioning countries, and this is something that, I've been up here going on 6 years, is how do we move countries from aid to trade? And if you look at our top 15 trading partners, 12 of them were recipient of foreign aid. And so we looked at a way that we can coalesce all the different agencies and departments. I think there's over 70 of them that give out some form of foreign aid and assistance. And so we wanted to bring them together, and we appreciate the input you've had on this. And moving forward, we met with a group today that rebutted what you just said, that the lending to private-owned enterprises, and we do not lend to state-owned enterprise. We brought that up, but they didn't believe that, so we sure could help you putting that out more. And I think one of the big things is to counter China. We can't compete with them dollar for dollar, and as we know, it's the one belt, one road, and I tell people it's one way, and it leads to the China's depositories. And they remind me of the robber barons of the old days in America, where they did this lending practices to consume what they lent to, as we saw with Sri Lanka and their port there. And so as we move forward with this, I think Chairman Royce brought out a very good point. It mobilizes the private capital markets, is what we see. And what I envision in this is by acting as a catalyst, the BUILD Act, acting as a catalyst to spur that private capital investment in countries that are searching for that investment, with the goal, again, to transition from foreign aid of the past, where we spent $1, to moving to where we're investing $1 in infrastructures, developing those economies where we can grow this. Now, knowing that we can't compete dollar for dollar with China, do you see this bill as a way to counter what they're doing in, like, the South China Sea? We know that that area in the ASEAN bloc of nations, there's going to be more people living in the Southeast China Sea area by 2050. There's going to be more people living in that than outside of that in the rest of the world. Do you see this as a good vehicle to start countering that, and that's one that's needed by this country?
Thank you, and your leadership has been critical to this bill, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
The entire DFI community, thank you.
This has been a team effort with the whole committee, so I appreciate it.
But speaking specifically to the South China Sea, one thing that OPEC does, as you know, is large infrastructure projects, things like ports, railroads, LNG plants, things that brings power and electricity. So as the Chinese have kind of swung under the underbelly of India, the Indians, I was recently in India, they have come to us and wanted us to come in and help prop up, with private enterprise, their ports and things, so the Chinese don't come in and control that area, because the Sri Lanka deal was a big wake-up call for that entire region.
It sure was. And we're seeing that in other areas like the Maldives and that island they're investing between Australia and the United States in the Hawaii area. Yes. And they're going to do that over and over again, and we've seen that in Djibouti. And we just need a vehicle that we can change the dynamics, and we haven't had a major reform to OPEC, which was started in '71, for the last 40 to 50 years, and this is something that is sorely needed. And I look forward to having your leadership on this, and any recommendations that you can give us. I don't know if you can in your official capacity, but anonymously, if you can give them to us through Edward, maybe, would be great. And we look forward to this getting moved down through that. And I think the biggest thing is, you know, how do you choose a country to go ahead and invest with the model that we're putting up here with the development finance? And I'd like to hear also your thoughts on the development finance institution that's being created, that we can partner with private enterprise and we can partner with other countries where before we were limited what we could do with OPIC. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll start with the first one on the regions that you spoke to. One is, as the chairman mentioned earlier, I'm going to the Summit of the Americas this afternoon. The Western Hemisphere is a top priority for this government. The Chinese have committed $10 billion to Port-au-Prince in Haiti. So right at the front door of the United States, they're going to control one of the largest ports. I'm meeting with multiple port development people and government officials in Mexico, Colombia, Peru, trying to see what the situation is there, because the ports in most of these countries, as you know, are controlled by private enterprise because they have the shipping, whether it's everything. I know we're talking to Dole Banana, actually in Peru. They've got a very large port on the Pacific that they want to expand because they need to get agricultural products out. The Chinese have stepped up and said they'd like to do it. The local governments are on to what the Chinese are up to, and so they've asked us to step in. When we look at multi-billion-dollar type projects, OPIC's maximum loan that we do to a single project is only $500 million. And only means these projects are multi-billion-dollar size projects.
Right.
But the fact that we have some involvement in it shows those host countries that the United States has an interest in keeping them secure.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and appreciate your support.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And without objection, I'd just like to submit for the record a statement by Elizabeth Littlefield, the former president and CEO of OPIC under the Obama administration, in support of this proposal to reform and modernize America's development finance toolkit. And also, I'd like to submit for the record a statement of support from the White House, also for Subcommittee Chairman Yoho's legislation here, the H.R. 5105, the BUILD Act, without objection. And we go now to Mr. Ami Bera.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Mr. Washburn, what you've been able to accomplish is pretty miraculously. The White House, Obama administration officials, Mr. Sherman, you know, a broad consensus, House and Senate, all supporting something. Mm-hmm. So maybe this is the beginning of a new era in Congress and in Washington, D.C. If not, it's a testimony to the importance of OPIC and the belief that the United States has to be engaged globally in a smart way, that we have to be looking at modernizing our ability to invest and compete around the world, again, in a smart way. You know, one thing that you touched on in one of your comments with the modernization, with the BUILD Act, was the ability to give OPIC equity authority versus just debt investment. If you could expand on, you know, the limitations that OPIC currently has, as well as with modernization and the ability to do equity authority, how that would benefit us.
Well, what the equity authority does is today we just give a debt instrument on a loan, which gives us senior status to all the other debt. If a project was to have issues with it, the equity gets wiped out and goes away. And that's fine, and we can continue doing that. The problem is where the world has gone is we've lowered, in many instances, the leverage we give on a project to not that much debt, maybe 50% debt or less, and the equity portion goes in. But other countries won't go in that if they think the United States is a superior position to them. And so we need the ability to put a portion, and we're talking about kind of club deals where you go in together with other countries. In some instances, some we'll do on our own, that we're able to compete more effectively on the worldwide scale that these other countries are going into. For example, in Japan, when I signed the MOU in Tokyo last fall, the Japanese want to co-invest with us in projects. but they don't want to do it where we're senior to them. And so we signed an MOU that we're going to look at projects where we can do it on a collaborative basis. On the debt side, if this legislation goes through, we'll be able to also do a portion of it on the equity side.
Right.
And the British have had equity authority since 1949, and so we're the last country, kind of the holdout, that hasn't done it.
So again, this would be an important tool, again,
Absolutely,
in your toolkit to modernize things. You also touched on, as you were highlighting some of the port deals and so forth. If I heard correctly, OPIC has a limit at $500 million. Is that what?
Well, currently per project.
Right.
Right.
And in the Build Act, would you be given greater authority?
Yes, sir, it would. I don't know the exact number. It would be. It'd be larger. Okay. Yes.
And raising that and giving you that ability as we look at the Chinese model and how China's investing, will it give us a competitive advantage, or at least a better advantage to?
Well, again, the Chinese are putting in sometimes 100% of the debt on projects. We'll keep our cap at an extreme basis, 75%. Okay. So there's still a large amount of equity in there. That's why the default rate is so low with OPIC. There's so much equity in projects behind us and we just back reputable developers and project sponsors that we haven't had an issue.
What is the default rate?
What?
What is
default rate? As I understand it, since OPIC was its inception, 1%.
It's pretty remarkable.
Yes, and OPIC's made a profit for 40 years in a row, including last year. OPIC made a profit of $260 million, but we call that deficit reduction. We give it back to you.
Absolutely.
So,
which certainly is a good thing. So, and for the taxpayers, that is a good deal.
Good.
As well. So, again, relatively non-controversial. I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Yoho, for his leadership on this. And, again, this is the type of thing that we ought to be able to get done in Congress. So
thank you, sir.
With that, I yield back.
We go to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I want to make sure that people understand that these microloans that were just touched on, how important they are to establishing to the people of the world that we're not just on the side of the big guys. We're not just going in and making friends with the rich people who control their societies. Countries like Cambodia, which was mentioned, where you have basically a criminal regime headed by Hun Sen, who was basically held power with brute force and corruption. These microloans do give people the sense of optimism that they can improve their lives and thus resist tyranny. So I'd like to make sure that that's clearly on the record, and I would imagine you agree with that.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me ask you this. OPIC, over the years, has OPIC ever lost money? And you might describe a situation where it has, if it has, lost money where they have guaranteed a loan to a business idea that didn't work out, and thus the taxpayers didn't get paid back?
Well, I haven't seen the records for the entire history of OPIC since I've been here in August. We haven't.
You haven't? Okay.
We haven't. So, but,
well,
sir, I'm happy for our staff to get with you and give you a complete list of all the transactions.
I think that I'd like to have you that list.
Yes, sir.
If you could have one of your staff, because the second part of that question is, now, because I would assume that the way we've set this up, that there have been situations where a private loan that was guaranteed by OPIC didn't pan out, and that the money was lost, and thus the American taxpayers were guaranteeing the loan, and thus we had to pay for it. The question then is, has there ever been a bank that lost any money once the OPIC has guaranteed a loan?
Sir, I'd have to get my staff with you to give you those details.
Well, what I'd like to know is the procedure that you use, does it put the bank that partner, basically we are ensuring that the bank will either break even or make a profit. Is there any risk that a business that receives this kind of a benefit is having to make in order to receive that benefit?
Well, banks, if we give a guarantee to a bank, we will give them a guarantee on the principal, not on the interest. So if a project was to go bad, again, these are real asset properties. These aren't software development company or something to where, I mean, it's a hard asset. So the hard asset doesn't go to zero. And so since we've been a senior lender, we have got, you know, an underlying asset to collect upon. Typically, there's 25% skin in the game, as I said, with the equity side of the equation, and that money gets lost. So if we did
So the bank actually, if something goes wrong, we miscalculated, we're trying to help some people, but they don't succeed, the bank actually loses money as well as the taxpayer.
No. Yeah. So I just want to clarify. So on a typical deal, if we put in 75% debt and there's 25% equity, of the 75% debt, the bank is at risk for 25 or that's 75%.
So the bank.
So they would lose 25. If $1 is lost,
I see.
The equity to the private developer gets totally wiped out, and then every lost dollar after that is 75% OPIC, 25%.
So there is some risk that these banks.
Oh, absolutely.
We're not just guaranteeing a profit and no loss. So.
Yeah, for example, we recently did a deal in Costa Rica for small business lending with a large U.S. commercial bank. We put in $50 million of that. They put in 25% of that, and then the local bank put in the equity of that. So if there is a loss on a loan, the local bank gets their equity wiped out, and once again, OPIC would lose 75%, and the partner institution, the U.S., would lose 25%.
Thanks for clarifying that. And just one note that the Chinese are deeply involved with, as we've already heard, throughout the developing world, and quite often they rely on bribes and on making sweetheart deals with government officials in countries that we are not really all that democratic. So that's something that if that's our competition, we have to understand that, and we do not want the Chinese to have this outreach and actually beginning to have that type of global influence. It is a negative influence on the world, and so we wish you luck in your restructuring, and hope we can work together in the future, even though Ed Royce, who's put his heart and soul into this all of these years, isn't going to be with us. We'll carry on, Ed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Greg Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Washburn, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, let me, I just want to say offhand, I really have, for the most part, believe that OPEC does excellent work. And this proposed of the Development Finance Corporation, I assume, is presumably to provide loans and grants and guarantees to businesses that commercial banks won't or can't support, right? That's basically what it's going to do. It gives people that opportunity. But, and I want to be sure that those efforts extend to, I'm always concerned about diversity, and that there's diversity in lending and everybody has an opportunity. So my first question is, how will the DFC work continue with existing, or will it continue to work with existing U.S. programs to complement traditional assistance and encourage diversity in its partnerships? Because oftentimes when I go to certain communities, there's no diversity, or they want to make sure they have the opportunity to be included in some of the lending and investment opportunities. So have you thought about how you'd make sure that there are diverse loans that are there?
Are you saying with U.S. companies?
Yes.
Yes. Well, but a big part of my job is being an outward-facing CEO and going and meeting with new potential people. Only 8% of our loans are with Fortune 500 companies. So we have 675 projects in 90 countries. So we have a very diverse, we have a very open marketing apparatus. We use the U.S. Commerce Department to help market us, as well as with this new legislation, USAID and their field offices are going to help drive us business.
So I just want to make sure, because we know there's a lot of minority and women-owned businesses that are looking to invest abroad.
Sure.
And I want to make sure that they have a clear opportunity in whether or not there will be specific policies within the new DFC that, you know, strong outreach to women and to minorities so that they know that you exist and they know what those opportunities are, because they are looking to do it, and oftentimes they don't know the opportunities that are there.
Yes, sir. Well, the first person I hired when I came to OPIC is a lady that set up a women's initiative area within OPIC. We committed $350 million from OPIC, which will catalyze $1 billion of investment, and I'm going to Lima this afternoon, and tomorrow we're having a large press conference to announce this. It's called the 2X Initiative. And as an example, I spoke earlier to that small business loan deal we did in Costa Rica. We required of that loan that 20% had to go to women-owned businesses. And so we've not only talked about it, we've put real money at work.
And on the flip side of that, I know that generally OPIC had been very conservative, which meant that many of the poorest countries were not included in the investment portfolio.
Okay.
So,
well,
I didn't see as many investments in some of the poor countries, and I was wondering if you could now, with this new DFC, there would be further investment in some of the poorest communities, like on the continent of Africa.
Sir, I think we have projects in almost every country in Africa, and I'm happy to submit to you where our projects are located and a map to show where they are. We're open in 130 countries. We're active in 90 countries. And so we are closed in the high-income countries or communist countries. So we're throughout Africa. In fact, I had a team over there a couple weeks ago. I'm going myself this summer for 2 weeks, and we are marketing ourselves heavily there. You know, as you know, OPIC was one of the leads of Electrify Africa. And
absolutely. And I want to be assured that that will continue.
oh, absolutely. Well, we look at Electrify.
You know, so let me ask this. I don't know whether this does anything or not. I know that under the BUILD Act, it proposes that the DFC have equity authority, right? You know, it's a tool that I know OPEC doesn't currently have. And I was just scratching my head, why is equity authority important? And how would that change the way that DFC approaches investments?
Well, sir, OPIC was set up in 1971, and the tools under which we loan to and invest with are pretty much the same as they were then. The world has changed a lot since then, and what equity authority enables us to do is partner up with other countries, such as England and Germany. Every other country that has a DFI has equity authority, and we're able then to participate in a lot more projects and a lot more deals. Currently, by just having a debt instrument, we are left out of a lot of things.
My time's up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. We go now to Mr. Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Washburn, for being here. I also want to recognize Mr. Mossbacker, who's in the audience today, and thank him for all of his work that he's done in this area. In 2016, Congress unanimously adopted my bill, the Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act, basically to strengthen accountability of development agencies, mainly reporting. Short verse, it's an audit of our foreign aid, foreign assistance, things we do in foreign countries. How are you ensuring accountability of OPIC to American taxpayers?
Well, sir, part of this bill is going to be funding for an internal IG, Inspector General, to come in. And so we fortunately have had very tough underwriting, and this is going to ensure as we go forward that the concerns you might have are going to be covered.
I noticed that was in the bill. I just wanted to hear it orally that that's a concern of yours, and you're going to make sure the American public knows how the money's being spent.
Yes, sir.
That's the purpose of the Foreign Aid Transparency Act. Tell me what your feelings are, opinion, and how Ex-Im Bank plays into all of this.
Well, I can't really speak to Ex-Im because it's a domestic-oriented institution. We're, as you know, totally international, and we can't do anything in the United States or its territories. So,
can you give me your opinion of the Ex-Im Bank?
I haven't studied it, sir.
What a great
I'm busy with
answer.
my day job, so I can't speak to that. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm a supporter of the Ex-Im Bank, and it's
Sure.
been stonewalled over in the Senate because the Senate refuses to appoint commissioners so that it can do what I think is a good beneficial not only to American but to other entities across the globe as well. What role does China play in financing similar entities and their government in dealing with foreign countries? What is China doing?
Well, they have the China Investment Corporation, or CIC, and they've committed several $1 trillion to that's their main investment entity, and that's what we come up against. And every country I travel to, you get off the plane, and China. I was in like last summer in Zambia, and you get off the airport. It's a Chinese airport being developed by the Chinese. You drive through town. They've just built a soccer stadium and given it to the government, and so it's a coordinated effort by the Chinese, as I said in my opening statement, that they want to tie together 65% of the world's population in their Belt and Road Initiative from China all the way around through the Suez Canal.
And they use Chinese workers when they build all these projects. They bring in all the Chinese. Locals don't build these projects, no matter where it is. It's Chinese workers come in and develop, build, construct,
Right.
maintain all of these projects.
And even a country like the country of Georgia, which has a port, if you look at the Belt and Road as it goes all the way to England, that's a key logistic point for the Chinese. And the Georgian government has come to us and said, will you help us finance the logistics port so the Chinese don't do it? Otherwise, the Chinese are going to do it. And that's a key. And you think the country of Georgia, how would that have anything to do with the Belt and Road? That is a key point for distribution. So we can't match them dollar for dollar, nor do we desire to match them dollar for dollar, because they do a lot of things that don't make any economic sense whatsoever. But we can back projects that are strategic to the United States.
Once again, I want to thank you for what you do. I believe this OPEC is not only a financial entity that works good for America and other countries, but it's a diplomatic positive for us and foreign countries. And I know this is going to shock the chairman, but I'm going to yield back a minute to the chair.
I thank Your Honor. Thank you, Judge. We go to Albio Suarez of New Jersey.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Washburn, thank you for being here. Thank you for helping us pay the debt that we owe by the money you turned to the Treasury. Just a little bit. You know, I have a couple of concerns, and I'm glad you're reorganizing, and I think it's the right thing to do. And you're focusing on the Western Hemisphere, which is one of the committees that I serve on. How does this political risk insurance work with some of these countries? I'm thinking in terms of Venezuela. You know, they've been just atrocious. Did we ever have any investment there or anything like that in the past?
No, sir, we're closed in Venezuela and have been for years. We don't have any projects there, nor are we allowed to even look at projects there.
Okay. And in terms of, we just had islands hit very badly by these hurricanes. U.S. Virgin Islands,
Yes, sir.
Puerto Rico, St. Thomas. Are you making any effort to partner up with the private sector to see if we can help or just some of the projects to assist these islands? Because they really are a mess, and I know that they don't have a lot of equity to put forward in some of these places when you do this partnership.
So, yeah, we are closed in U.S. territory, so I can't go to Puerto Rico. But we committed $1 billion to the Caribbean region, where the Dominican Republic, a lot of the islands throughout there, and we are working on multiple projects right now, primarily infrastructure, power grids, ports, upgrading airports.
That's what I was thinking in terms of some of these islands that got hit so hard.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is very little money goes a very long way in a lot of those islands, but we are very actively, obviously we're not open in Cuba or Venezuela, but everything else to that region, we're very actively engaged.
So in other words, Puerto Rico is out of the question?
Yes, sir, it's a U.S. territory.
So the U.S. Virgin Island also?
That's out. St. Croix's out.
St. Croix.
You know, the Solomon Islands, you know, anything that's a U.S. territory.
Is there any way in your new reorganization that you can try to include some of these places that got hit so hard by these hurricanes?
Sir, this is an international group. That's not in the legislation currently. I mean, if that's something the committee wanted to change, but that's not what OPIC was for. There are other aid programs that feed to the domestic issues.
I mean,
And I tell you, we did look at the Puerto Rico issue when that hit. You know, obviously we got a lot of calls and a lot of things, and our staff looked at it, and that we just can't participate in there
totally.
at all. Yeah, yes, sir.
And this political risk insurance, can you go with that again for me? How does this work?
Okay, well, sometimes we just do the political risk insurance. We don't even do a loan. But if a company is going to build a project, for example, like a power project in Vietnam, which is a communist government, but they've got democratic reforms, we're trying to get them away from the Chinese. We gave them a political risk insurance, which meant we get a contract that we guarantee will be honored. And then we go to the Vietnamese government and we get a counterparty that if they sell electricity produced by an LNG plant into the Vietnamese grid, they don't change contract terms, they don't nationalize it, expropriate it, and those things. And the governments know that it's the U.S. government with an insurance policy on that, and that's why we had a very low default rate, because people realize it's actually the U.S. government they're changing the contract terms on.
Okay. Chairman, I'm also finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you for yielding back. Mr. Tom Garrett of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the committee and specifically Member Yoho, as well as Mr. Washburn and the administration for advancing this initiative. A moment ago you said, and I quote verbatim, the Chinese do a lot of things that don't make any economic sense. I agree. Would you submit that they make strategic sense?
I would.
And so if the Chinese are not dumb, and they're not, and they're doing things that don't make economic sense with lots and lots of money, would it seem then logical to presume that they're doing them in order to advance our strategic agenda?
Well, they could do things like build a soccer stadium in Zambia. It makes no economic sense, and then just give it away.
Right?
So,
but they might do that to curry favor with the regime in Zambia, for example, and that would be then advancing our strategic agenda, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, I'm not trying to be hostile. I think what you're doing is great, and I think you're doing it well. But I've pointed out in this committee before that there seem to be two paradigms in the patterns of foreign aid. The Chinese tend to give aid to dictatorial regimes and autocrats, for example, building entire presidential palaces that rival in size and scope, say, for example, the Rayburn office building with Chinese dollars and then giving them to foreign autocrats, versus the United States, which renders aid in the form of clean water and food to people, right? There's aid to the top and aid to the people. And I would submit that the American paradigm works only when the people exist in a nation wherein the people have the ability and the right to assert themselves. And where that is the case, that indeed the American paradigm is superior to the Chinese paradigm. We get more bang for the buck. We generate more goodwill. I'll tell you that as a soldier deployed in uniform, every pack of M&Ms I pulled out of my MRE went to a young person in that nation where I was deployed, so that the memory that they had would be of an American soldier giving them a pack of candy that they might not otherwise have the opportunity to enjoy ever. And I hoped at the time, as a 20-something, that that might foster goodwill amongst these young people towards our nation moving forward. The Chinese paradigm is give their dad $1. But I'm not going down this road wantonly. I would submit that this legislation and the bipartisan nature thereof should, and I think it was Dr. Barra who said, serve as a wake-up call or maybe a new beginning. That when Vandenberg suggested that politics should stop at the water's edge, all too often in this committee and Homeland Security, I understand it in Education and Workforce where I also sit, I've seen partisan sniping by this side taking shots at policies from the previous administration, and by that side taking shots at this administration, which don't serve to advance the Americans' nation's best interest at home or abroad. And it makes me want to pull my hair out that we should get back to that Vandenberg concept that politics should stop at the water's edge, because we're so darn far behind here that I wonder if we can catch up. And I'm not trying to lecture you, but this needs to be said. Maybe somebody somewhere will watch it and take it to heart. An American prominent political philosopher recently stated publicly that there were inherent advantages to the autocratic regime in China by virtue of their ability to act decisively without debate. Now, as someone who is absolutely passionately in love with the idea of the American experiment, that individuals should have the rights to make decisions for themselves, that the best interest of the collective is advanced best by empowering the individual, I loathe the idea that that person might have been right. But to the extent that we can all get behind something that makes more efficient private investment in foreign nations in a manner such to create alliances and strengthen trade partnerships to advance not only the interest of the United States, but of free and those who aspire to be free across the planet, it's about time. So thank you for what you're doing. My genuine and sincere thanks to my colleagues on the other side of the dais. We need to work together to get this sort of thing right because we are being lapped by people who do not have the best interest of freedom and self-determination at their hearts. I'd yield back.
We thank the gentleman for yielding. Karen Bass of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And once again, thank you for your leadership in bringing a bipartisan bill that I think is really going to make a difference. And I also want to thank Representative Yoho for your leadership on this bill. Mr. Washburn, I appreciated our conversation yesterday and welcome you to OPEC. Excited that you're there and very excited by this initiative. I raised a couple of concerns with you yesterday that I think were probably in reference to a much earlier version of the bill, and now that I've had time to look at it, very excited about it. So I want to ask you, in terms of moving forward in the future, I know one of the things that you were saying yesterday that you thought was going to be helpful was the fact that the DFI would not have staff, you know, around the world, but you could take advantage of staff that were already there from USAID or in embassies. So if you look at what the British are doing, which they call their DFI CDC, they do have staff, you know, around the world. So thinking out in the future, do you see the need for that? How do you think, would you want to come back to us and ask for that type of support? How do you think this will develop in the future?
We want to use the USAID staff, and we also use a lot of the Commerce Department. They have staff in almost every embassy around the country for their purposes, and this, through just a joint marketing thing, we have been very successful with them. When I was recently in the Ukraine, we went and marketed to a number of companies there, U.S. companies that were there through the Commerce Department's embeds into the embassy, their Commerce Department.
So you see that model being stagnant? You don't see it growing?
Oh, I see it growing. It's a big education process that people feel that, you know, with this modernization of it going forward. I'm with the State Department. We obviously interface with them on a daily basis about countries we're going to, what's strategic, where should we stay out of, we're going to be cautious. So, yes, ma'am. And I also checked yesterday, you asked on the African Women's Entrepreneurship Program.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that.
And it's a State Department grant program.
Yes.
And one that is going to continue under OPIC, and that state can contact us with women entrepreneurs, and through that program that we can give them financing to OPIC. So it stays in USAID? State, but we provide the capital for it.
Right, okay, good,
Yes,
good.
That continue. I went and checked on that for you. And on the African trade hubs.
Oh, before you move on to that, at AWEP then, if you would be providing the financing, I would think that AWEP would be able to expand then.
Oh, absolutely.
Is that correct? You would be adding much more resources than currently exists.
Right, and the head of our 2X Women's Initiative, I talked to her yesterday, and she's actually going to Lima with us today, and when she gets back, that's the top of her agenda to get on.
Great, I appreciate that. And you were going to reference the trade hubs?
Oh, you asked about the trade hubs, and we see that as those as a key source to kind of be rainmaking deals for us in these areas.
So how do you think you would specifically collaborate with them?
Well, no, it's just market. I mean, they just could submit us ideas and things that we market off of.
Okay. We probably at another point should talk a little more about that, because I think that there have been improvements in the trade hubs.
Right.
There's definitely the need to have more trade hubs on the continent of Africa. But how successful they are and how that collaboration, I think it could be very beneficial, but we probably deserves deeper conversation.
Good. Okay.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair. Oh, I'd be happy to yield to you, Mr. Conlon.
Because I'm going to be brief. Thank you so much. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I would ask that an opinion piece on the Development Credit Authority published in devex.com be entered into the record.
Without objection.
So I thank the chair. Have you seen this op-ed piece by former aid administrator Natsios raising some concerns about including the U.S. aid piece in a superannuated DFI, and that it would, they claim, would hurt aid's ability to finance longer-term development projects?
Sir, I haven't seen the article, but Administrator Green is in full support of this, and
yeah, but that's not my question. I'm trying to get at the substance of it. Do they have a point that potentially this could hurt USAID's capacity without intending to, and have you taken that into consideration?
From the legislation that's been presented to us, which USAID has given its approval to, I don't understand what the issue would be.
Would you be willing to talk to former AID Republican Administrator Natsios on this matter?
I'd be happy to speak with him, sure. He has never reached out to me. I have not seen that article, but I wish he had contacted me before he wrote it.
We'll make it available.
Okay, thank you.
I thank you. Thank you to my colleague.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
And earlier debate here, we had some of the discussions about the linkages to make sure that we guaranteed the expertise and involvement of those men and women on the ground. It probably would behoove us to, as the bill moves forward, define that a little more precisely. And so, in keeping with the gentleman's point, we'd be happy to work with you in order to strengthen and guarantee that symbiotic relationship there and the use of that personnel and experience on the ground.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you so much for that intervention, because that's the only point I'm trying to make. There can be unintended consequences, and let's make sure there aren't.
Precisely.
And certainly, Mr. Natsios has some gravity in this matter that should be considered, and why he didn't reach out to Mr. Washburn, I don't know, but we can fix that.
In his own way, I think he did.
Okay, that's right. I thank the chair.
Thank you. We go now to Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Ed Royce, for your long-time commitment to the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. The chairman has been an OPEC cheerleader for a number of years, understanding how important what you're doing. And Mr. Washburn, your background is just, my view, perfect, fulfilling something that I really respect, that President Trump has appointed people of great talent to serve. So thank you very, very much. And we all look forward in a bipartisan manner working together with you. OPEC has a dual mandate to support development while advancing America's foreign policy interest. How does it balance with these priorities?
With our foreign policy objectives?
Yes.
Well, it's a tool of foreign policy in the sense that countries or regions that the U.S. government would like to prop up through free enterprise. And I'll give you an example. In the Northern Triangle of Central America, where there's a very, very high unemployment rate, we've been tasked with finding companies that can go down there and create employment to help stabilize those regions. And so that is a big part of our mandate, is how do we create employment in those regions.
And I wish you well. I last summer had the opportunity for the Food for the Hungry program to visit Guatemala.
Right.
And it was exciting to me to see the level of economic development that was very clear in Guatemala City, and then needed in the more rural areas. So what you're doing is making a difference. How does the dual mandate compare to other development finance institutions, including China's development finance model? And should support or preference for U.S. jobs and commercial interests be an explicit mandate in the new development finance institutions?
Well, the Chinese goal, the strategic goal, is the Belt and Road Initiative and also worldwide trade. So they have gotten into the Western Hemisphere through the Panama Canal. They're trying to control, as I said earlier, through a lot of the ports and things like that. So they open the trade passages for their ships. So, you know, we're very cognizant on where they are. I've signed an MOU with the Australian government recently when their prime minister was in D.C. to where we're going to work with the Australians and the Japanese on trying to strengthen the outer islands outside of Australia on things like they need undersea cables to get communication going, that the Chinese are trying to control that. And so those are areas, and like I said earlier, we can't match them dollar for dollar, but we can strategically find some places to.
Well, it's really making a difference, and we all appreciate that. What opportunities for cooperation exist between OPEC and foreign DFIs to address common development goals? Under your leadership, OPEC has signed memorandums of understanding with Japan and Kazakhstan to support development finance cooperation. Does OPEC have other similar agreements or plans for additional cooperation with foreign DFIs?
Well, actually, those MOUs are with, we also have one with Australia, as I mentioned. We're currently working on one with India, to where Japan, Australia, India, and the United States will combine forces in that Indo-Pacific region and try to share in projects we can do together and intelligence that we can, you know, find projects to go into. As far as other DFIs, each country has specific regions or areas they're interested in. A lot of them are interested in Africa, and OPIC was the leader on the Power Africa initiative, where we've invested over $2.5 billion to help electrify Africa, and other countries look for us to be the lead. And so they're smaller. A lot of them are organized together, and they would like to invest together, and that's why the Equity Authority is so important to us, because a lot of them, that is how they invest, is through equity, not through debt.
And I'm grateful to hear about the working relationship with India. I'm very grateful that I have worked very closely with Chairman Ed Royce, who was the former chairman of the Caucus of India and Indian Americans, and I followed him. And the opportunities that we have with Prime Minister Narendra Modi are just so positive. So this is really very good news. You pride yourself on a self-sustaining agency which returns funds to the Treasury every year. Will the new DFI also be expected to make returns to taxpayers?
Yes, sir.
And that's good. Yeah. In fact, that is so good, I yield back my time. You were very clear. We're not used to people being this clear. Thank you very much. I yield back.
We go now to Norma Torres of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Washburn, thank you for all the work that you're doing. I have very focused my work in the Western Hemisphere, specifically. I co-lead the Central America Caucus. It's a bipartisan caucus that has been focused on the Northern Triangle. I understand that OPIC has an active project in Guatemala involving Bank Rural. Is a rural development bank linked to the government of Guatemala. Unfortunately, there's been accusations of public corruption. Are you aware of these allegations?
You know, Citibank is the lead on that particular loan. I don't have the, you know, minute details of that, but OPIC's loan is through Citibank, and they're the ones managing that relationship, and that's the only project we have.
My question is, sir, are you aware of these allegations of public corruption?
Well, there's a lot of corruption in Guatemala throughout.
That is not my question, sir.
Right. On that particular deal, I don't have the specifics, no ma'am.
So what is it that you do to ensure that you are not working and that American dollars, taxpayers' dollars, are not going to corrupt individuals, the drug cartels, the people that are harming the people that are making their way north to our southern border, the people that we're trying to help in trying to address the root causes of migration, which is a primary objective of this administration?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I first started at OPIC, I was asked to focus on the Northern Triangle, where OPIC had not had a focus in a long, long time. And
I appreciate that.
In El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, I took a trip there. My teams have been down there multiple times on looking for projects we can do to help the people on the ground. Electrification, transportation, as you know, in Guatemala, it's very difficult to drive anywhere with the mountainous roads. Try to go in with ag businesses where they can get the agriculture out of the mountains and to the ports and out, where the ports are very undersized. And we realize the immigration issue, but we feel with creating opportunities of employment in those countries, that'll stabilize those.
I wholeheartedly agree with you, sir. The issue is because of there is so much public corruption, opportunities for American business to thrive there when they're having to compete with other local organizations that may be having to pay off a corrupt government official. I want to know, what steps are you taking to work with the attorney generals in this region, with CSIG, specifically with Moxie, to ensure that the folks that you are trying to help are not the ones that are hurting our American agenda?
Well, the businesses that we back to go in those countries are very well vetted. We always go in with a U.S. partner like a Citibank or someone like that, who they go through their own anti-corruption.
Should my question be addressed then to Citibank to see why, as an American banking institution, is doing business with a corrupt organization in Central America? Is that what your statement here today?
My statement is we do very intense investigations of the people we do business with, as well as the lending institutions we partner with.
What does that look like, an intense investigation?
Well, I'm happy for our staff to come over and walk you through exactly how we process a loan, how we monitor a loan, and how we do background checks on who we deal with.
I know that this is an uncomfortable conversation to have and to have publicly, but I need to have some reassurances that while you're working there, and we want you to continue to work to create local opportunities for the youth there, but at the same time, I don't want you to focus and for the work to damage the work that we are doing in trying to address the public corruption issues there by providing opportunities for these corrupt individuals to continue to thrive.
We're very happy to sit down with you and your staff and walk through everything. All our loans are totally transparent. You can go on the web and see who we do business with. And so I'm happy to come over at any time. And
just for the record, Mr. Chairman, since I can't get an answer from our guests here today, does that mean that this is a classified briefing that I need to ask for?
Congresswoman Torres raises a point which has to do with a case for which she's seen a press report. We have strong laws on the books in terms of, well, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and other laws which should guarantee that we do not have a situation where U.S. agencies are engaged with financial interests overseas. A cartel is what you refer to. There are also laws on the books that prevent the engagement here in terms of involvement with foreign governments overseas. So, that being the case, I would suggest, Congresswoman Torres, you and I and the ranking member should meet along with the staff of the agency, and we should review this particular case, get to the details, and have their investigative people come in, and we'll get to the bottom of it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Very good. We go now to Mr. Mike McCall of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ray, good to see you again. We've known each other for quite some time. I want to applaud and commend the President's decision to put you in this position. I can't think of a stronger mind, business leader, and someone with just dogged determination to get things done. And I think you bring a fresh enthusiasm to what was becoming not such a fresh face for us, and it's what we need right now. And we need it from a foreign policy standpoint. It's really the soft power piece that complements what our military does around the world. So again, I want to thank you. I want to say personally, anything we can do to assist your mission, we're strongly supportive of you. My question has to do with, I get two, but the first one, China. They are a superpower now. It's hard to compete. As you know, they're in Africa, they're in South America. Their model, they have $12.6 billion in loans now. It's also hard to compete with a country that doesn't have any anti-corruption practices laws on them, so they can walk in a room and hand basically a suitcase full of cash Our guys, we obviously can't do that. We're prohibited by federal law. They also offer to build soccer stadiums to get their contracts, to get access into these countries. So I guess my first question is, how do you compete with someone when you're on sort of an unlevel playing field from the get-go? And they have made great advances and strides in both of these continents.
Thank you for your comments, first of all. I appreciate those. You know, the Chinese, we're not going to match them dollar for dollar. And your point of soft power is exactly what OPIC is. It's a soft power agency of foreign policy for the United States. And so there are certain areas we can go in. If the Chinese are at Port-au-Prince, which I mentioned earlier, they're rebuilding the port there, which gives them control. Then as a counteract, we need to find other ports. We should have been the ones in there doing that, and we kind of fell asleep at the switch. I don't know why we weren't there. And so it's more of a strategic play for us because our dollars are very limited because I am not an aid agency. We are a business agency. And I have to underwrite projects that businesses believe will make a profit and come back because they have so much equity in them. So building a soccer stadium obviously serves no purpose. Building a port that's like in Sri Lanka that made no sense to begin with, well, we can't find a developer to do that, and we're not an aid agency. So we're very strategic on where we go and what we're investing in.
Well, I think Djibouti's another example where we actually have a military post there, and they're there as well. I think one argument that always plays against them, though, are these countries that they move into. It doesn't benefit the host country at the end of the day. They may have shiny objects they can wave in front of them, but they really don't invest in the well-being of the country's health overall. In fact, they bring in their own workers, you know, many times, and it brings no real, I think, assets to the host country itself. And so hopefully over time, countries in Africa and South America will see that, and they'll turn away from that competition. Secondly, I think maybe Mr. Yoho may have asked you this question, but I co-sponsored his BUILD Act, which creates a U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, and it really helps leverage all the loans that you have with OPIC and USAID's Development Credit Authority. Are you supportive of this? I know it was in the president's budget as well.
I am supportive, and Administrator Mark Green's supportive of it. The White House, we gave them a letter last night. They're in support. In fact, USAID and I met, and so yes, I am supportive of it.
And just to close, I mean, I think again, your enthusiasm is welcome here. You're going to do a great job, and OPIC has a great story to tell because most of it can bring billions of dollars of investment, yet with not a whole lot of appropriations from Congress, and so a lot of it's primarily self-funded. And I think we should be taking greater advantage of OPEC's reach and authorities throughout the globe to advance, the United States' interest abroad. When we have such a complex world right now with Russia and China being expansive, and with Iran and North Korea and so many hot spots, I really applaud your leadership, sir, and I look forward to working with you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. I want to thank Mr. Washburn for being here today and for sharing the administration's views on the importance of development finance and how it can be reformed, and for your support here today for Subcommittee Chairman Yoho's BUILD Act. I know you're on your way to the Summit of the Americas, but before you go, I also want to acknowledge Edward Burrier sitting behind you. Edward was the Deputy Staff Director of this committee and one of our closest advisors for many years, and Edward's one of the best. And while it's a little strange to see him sitting behind the witness and not behind the chairman, I can't imagine anyone better than Edward to be serving you at OPIC. And we thank Edward for his work and dedication. And Mr. Washburn, we wish you all the best in Peru. The hearing stands adjourned.
Opinions of the source are in no way endorsed. Yeah, but I mean, pretty prominent with this bill.
excuse me, Andy. Yes, sir. Good job, Andy. Thank you.